Alrighty, we are going to finish up Mr. Popper's Penguins today. Chapter 18, April Winds. If it was unseasonably warm in Boston, it was actually hot in New York. In their rooms at the Great Tower Hotel overlooking Central Park, the penguins were feeling the heat badly. Mr. Popper took them up to the roof garden to catch whatever cool breeze might be blowing. The penguins were all charmed by the sparkling lights and the confusion of the city below. The younger birds began crowding over to the edge of the roof and looking down at the great canyons beneath them. It made Mr. Popper very nervous to see them shoving each other as if at any moment they might succeed in pushing one over. He remembered how the South Pole penguins always did this to find out what danger lay below. The roof was not a safe place for them. Mr. Popper had never forgotten how badly frightened he had been when Captain Cook had been so ill before Greta came. He could not risk the chance of losing one of his penguins now. Where the penguins were concerned, nothing was ever too much trouble for him. He took them downstairs again and bathed them under the cold showers in the bathroom. This kept him busy a large part of the night. With all this lack of sleep, he was quite drowsy the next morning when he had to call the taxis to get to the theater. Besides, Mr. Popper had always been a little absent-minded. That is how he made his great mistake when he said to the first taxi driver, "Regal Theater." "Yes, sir," said the driver, threading his way in and out of the traffic of Broadway, which greatly interested both the children and the penguins. They had almost reached the theater when the driver suddenly turned. "Say," he said, "you don't mean to say those penguins are going to be on the same bill with Swenson's seals, do you?" "I don't know what else is on the bill," said Mr. Popper, paying him. "Anyway, here's the Regal." And they piled out and filed in the stage entrance. In the wings stood a large, burly, red-faced man. "So these are the Popper performing penguins, huh?" he said. "Well, I want to tell you, Mr. Popper, that I'm Swenson, and those are my seals in there on the stage now, and if your birds try any funny business, it'll be too bad for them. My seals are tough, see? They think nothing of eating 2 or 3 penguins apiece." From the stage could be heard the hoarse barks of the seals who were going through their act. "Papa," said Mrs. Popper, "the penguins are the last act on the bill. You go run back quick and get those taxis, and we'll get the penguins right around a while until it's time for their number." Mr. Popper hurried out to catch the drivers. When he returned, it was too late. The Popper performing penguins had already discovered the Swenson seals. "Papa, I can't look!" cried the children. There was a sound of dreadful confusion on the stage, the audience was in an uproar, and the curtain was quickly rung down. When the Poppers rushed onto the stage, both penguins and seals had found the stairway leading to the Swenson dressing room and were on their way upstairs. "I can't bear to think what's happening up there," said Mr. Popper, with a shudder. Mr. Swenson only laughed. "I hope your birds were insured, Popper," he said. "How much were they worth?" "Well, let's go up and look." "You go up, Papa," said Mrs. Popper. "Bill, you run out of the theater and call the police to come and try to save some of our penguins." "I'll go get the fire department," said Janny. When the firemen, with a great clanging, came and set up their ladders so that they could get in through the window of Mr. Swenson's dressing room, they were a little vexed to find that there was no fire at all. Vexed means upset. However, when they found 6 black-mustached seals sitting barking in the middle of the room with 12 penguins parading gaily around them in a square, they felt better. Then the policemen came in their patrol and climbed up the ladder which the firemen had left against the building. By the time they too came through the window, they could scarcely believe their eyes, for the firemen had put firemen's helmets on the penguins, which made the delighted birds look very silly and girlish. Seeing the firemen so friendly with the penguins, the policemen naturally took sides with the seals and put policemen's caps on them. The seals looked very fierce with their long black mustaches and black faces underneath. The penguins under their firemen's helmets were parading in front of the policemen, while the seals in their policemen's caps were barking at the firemen, when Mr. Popper and Mr. Swenson finally opened the door. Mr. Popper sat down. His relief was so great that for a moment he could not speak. "You policemen had better get your hats off my seals now," said Mr. Swenson. "I got to go down on the stage and finish the act now." Then he and his 6 seals slipped out of the room with a few parting barks. "Well, goodbye, ducks," said the firemen, regretfully removing their helmets from the penguins and putting them on their own heads. Then they disappeared down the ladder. The penguins, of course, wanted to follow, but Mr. Popper held them back. Just then the door flew open, and the theater manager burst into the room. "Hold that man," he shouted to the policeman, pointing at Mr. Popper. "I have a warrant for his arrest." "Who, me?" said Mr. Popper in a daze. "What have I done?" "You've broken into my theater and thrown the place into a panic, that's what you've done. You're a disturber of the peace." "But I'm Mr. Popper, and these are my performing penguins, famous from coast to coast." "I don't care who you are, you haven't any business in my theater." "But Mr. Greenbaum is going to pay us $5,000 for a week at the Regal." Mr. Greenbaum's theater is the Royal, not the Regal. You've come to the wrong theater. Anyway, out you go, you and your performing penguins. The patrol is waiting outside. Chapter 19, Admiral Drake. So Mr. Popper, with Captain Cook, Greta, Columbus, Louisa, Nelson, Jenny, Magellan, Adelina, Scott, Isabella, Ferdinand, and Victoria, was bundled into the patrol wagon and hustled off to the police station. None of his pleas could move the desk sergeant. That theater manager is pretty mad at the way you busted into his theater, so I'm holding you. I'm going to give you all a nice, quiet cell. Unless you furnish bail. I'm putting the bail at $500 for you and $100 for each of the birds. Of course, Mr. Popper did not have that much money about him. Neither did Mrs. Popper when they telephoned her at the hotel. The hotel bill was paid for several days ahead, but she had no cash. The check for the final week's salary was not due until the end of the week. Indeed, it now looked as if the Poppers would never see that check, since they could not get the penguins out of jail long enough to put on their act at the Royal Theater. If only they could have got in touch with Mr. Greenbaum, Mr. Popper knew that kind man would have got them out. But Mr. Greenbaum was somewhere in Hollywood out on the Pacific coast, and the Poppers had no idea how to reach him. It was very dull for the birds in jail. Wednesday came, and there was still no word from Mr. Greenbaum. Thursday, and the birds began to droop. It was soon apparent that the lack of exercise combined with the heat might prove too much for them. There were no more tricks or merry games. Even the younger birds sat all day in dismal silence, and Mr. Popper could not cheer them up. Mr. Popper had a feeling that Mr. Greenbaum would probably turn up by the end of the week to see about renewing the contract, but Friday passed without any news of him. Saturday morning, Mr. Popper got up very early and smoothed his hair. Then he dusted off the penguins as well as he could, for he wanted everything to look as presentable as possible in case Mr. Greenbaum should appear. About 10 o'clock, there was a sound of footsteps in the corridor and a jingling of keys, and the door of the cell was opened. "You're free, Mr. Popper. There's a friend of yours here." Mr. Popper stepped out into the light with the penguins. "You're barely in time, Mr. Greenbaum," he was about to say. Then, as his eyes became accustomed to the light, he looked again. It was not Mr. Greenbaum who stood there. It was a great, bearded man in a splendid uniform, smiling. He held out his hand to Mr. Popper. "Mr. Popper," he said, "I am Admiral Drake." "Admiral Drake?" gasped Mr. Popper. "Not back from the South Pole?" "Yes," said the Admiral. "The Drake Antarctic Expedition ship returned yesterday. You should have seen the reception New York gave us. You can read about it in today's paper. But I read about the trouble you were having over the penguins, and so here I am. I have a long story to tell you." "Could we go to the hotel and talk about it?" asked Mr. Popper. "My wife will be anxious to see us back." "Certainly," said the Admiral, and when they were all settled in the Popper rooms at the hotel, with the penguins clustering round to listen, Admiral Drake began. "Naturally, when I knew that I was coming back to America, I often thought about the man to whom I had sent the penguin. It takes us a long time to hear things down there, and I often wondered how you and the bird were getting along. Last night at the mayor's dinner for us, I heard about the wonderful trained penguin act you had been putting on all over the country. This morning I picked up the paper, and the first thing I read was that Mr. Popper and his 12 penguins were still being held in jail. But 12 penguins? Mr. Popper, how on earth?" Then Mr. Popper told how Greta had arrived to keep Captain Cook from being lonely, and how the little penguins had grown, and how the clever little band had saved the day for the Poppers when things looked bad. "It's amazing," said Admiral Drake. "I've seen a lot of penguins in my time, but never such educated ones as these. It certainly shows what patience and training can do. But now, to get to my real point, Mr. Popper, you probably know that I have explored the North Pole as well as the South Pole?" "Oh, yes," said Mr. Popper respectfully. "I have read books about both your Arctic and your Antarctic expeditions." "Well then," said the Admiral, "maybe you know why we explorers prefer the South Pole?" "Could it be on account of the penguins, sir?" asked Jenny, who had been listening very hard. Admiral Drake patted her head. "Yes, my dear, those long polar nights get pretty dull when you have no pets to play with. Of course, there are polar bears up there, but you can't play with them. Nobody knows why there are no penguins at the North Pole. For a long time, the United States government has been wanting me to lead an expedition up there for the purpose of establishing a breed of penguins. I must come to the point, Mr. Popper. You've had such remarkable success with these birds of yours. Why not let me take them to the North Pole and start a race of penguins there?" Just then, Mr. Greenbaum and another gentleman were announced. They shook hands all around and were introduced to the Admiral. "Well, Popper," said Mr. Greenbaum, "too bad about that mix-up over the theaters, but never mind. Here's Mr. Klein, who owns the Colossal Film Company. He's going to make your fortune. You'll be a poor man no longer, Mr. Popper." "Poor?" said Mr. Popper. "I'm not poor. These birds have been earning us $5,000 a week." "Oh, $5,000, said Mr. Klein. "What's that? pin money. I want to put those birds in the movies, Mr. Popper. We've got the story department working on stories for them already. Why, I'll put each of those birds under a contract that will keep you and the missus on Easy Street the rest of your lives." "Papa," whispered Mrs. Popper, "I don't want to live on Easy Street. I want to go back to Proudfoot Avenue." "Better consider, Mr. Popper," said the Admiral. "I can't offer you anything like that." "You say those men at the North Pole get lonely because there are no penguins?" asked Mr. Popper. "Very lonely," said the Admiral. "But if there were penguins up there, mightn't the polar bears eat them?" "Oh, ordinary penguins, yes," said the Admiral judiciously, "but not such highly trained birds as yours, Mr. Popper. They could outwit any polar bear, I guess." It was now Mr. Klein's turn to speak. In every moving picture house in America, little children would have the pleasure of seeing stories acted by the Popper performing penguins, he said. "Of course, if we succeeded in establishing the breed at the North Pole," said the Admiral, "the name might have to be changed a little. I imagine that hundreds of years from now scientists would be calling them the Popper Arctic penguins." Mr. Popper was silent for a moment. "Gentlemen," he said, "I want to thank you both. I'll give you my decision tomorrow." Chapter 20. Farewell, Mr. Popper. It was a hard decision to make. Long after the visitors had gone, Mr. and Mrs. Popper sat and discussed what was best for everybody. Mrs. Popper could see the advantages of both offers, and she pointed these out without trying to influence him. "I feel that the penguins are really your responsibility," she said, "and you must make up your mind." It was a pale and haggard Mr. Popper who was ready to announce his decision the next day. "Mr. Klein," he said, "I want you to know how much I appreciate your offer of putting my birds in the movies, but I am afraid I have to refuse. I do not believe the life in Hollywood would be good for the penguins." Then he turned to Admiral Drake. "Admiral Drake, I am going to give you the birds. In doing this, I am considering the birds first of all. I know that they have been comfortable and happy with me. Lately, though, with the excitement and the warm weather, I've been worried about them. The birds have done so much for me that I have to do what is best for them. After all, they belong in a cold climate. And then I can't help being sorry for those men up at the North Pole without any penguins to help them pass the time." "Your government will thank you, Mr. Popper," answered the Admiral. "Congratulations, Admiral," said Mr. Klein. "Maybe you're right at that, Popper. Hollywood might have been too much for the birds. I wish you'd let me make one short movie of them here in New York, though, before they go. Just some pictures of the sort of thing they do on the stage, you know? We'd show the film everywhere with an announcement that these are the famous Popper penguins that are being taken to the North Pole by Admiral Drake of the United States Arctic Penguin Founding Expedition," or something like that. "I'd like that very much," said Mr. Popper. "We'd pay you, of course," continued Mr. Klein. "Not a fortune, as we could have if you'd let us give them a contract, but say $25,000. "We could use it," said Mrs. Popper. "It will be very quiet at 432 Proudfoot Avenue," said Mr. Popper when everyone had left. Mrs. Popper did not answer. She knew that nothing she could say could really comfort him. "However," said Mr. Popper, "now that spring is here, a lot of people will be wanting their houses painted, so we'd better be getting back." "Anyway," said Bill, "we've had 10 whole weeks of vacation right in the middle of the year, and not many children in Stillwater can say that." The next day, the cameramen arrived to make the picture of the penguins doing their tricks. It was arranged that the Poppers should stay in New York just long enough to see the expedition off. Meanwhile, in the harbor, the great sailing ship of Admiral Drake was being made ready for its long trip north. Every day, huge boxes of supplies of all sorts were hustled on board. The most comfortable quarters on the ship were turned over to the penguins, who were the cause of the voyage. Captain Cook was already quite familiar with the ship, since it was the same one the Admiral had sailed to the South Pole, where Captain Cook had often seen it. Greta, too, had seen vessels of its kind. The two of them were kept very busy showing and explaining everything to Nelson, Columbus, Louisa, Jenny, Scott, Magellan, Adelina, Isabella, Ferdinand, and Victoria. The sailors all took the greatest delight in watching the curious little birds of their explorations. "It looks as if this will be a pretty lively trip," they would say. "These Popper penguins certainly live up to their reputation." But at last everything was ready, and the day came when the Poppers were to go down and say goodbye. Bill and Janny ran all over the ship and did not want to leave when it was time to draw up the gangplank. The Admiral shook hands with them and Mrs. Popper and thanked them for having helped to train the extraordinary penguins that were to be of real contribution to science. Mr. Popper had gone down below to say a private farewell to his birds. All that kept him from breaking down completely was the knowledge that what he was doing was best for them, too. First, he said goodbye to all the younger penguins, then to Greta, who had saved Captain Cook. Then, last of all, he leaned over and said a special goodbye to Captain Cook, who had come and made life so different for Mr. Popper. Then he wiped his eyes, straightened his back, and went up on deck to say goodbye to Admiral Drake. "Goodbye, Admiral Drake," he said. "Goodbye?" repeated the Admiral. "Why, what do you mean? Aren't you coming with us?" "Me? Go with you to the North Pole?" "Why, of course, Mr. Popper. But how could I go with you? I'm not an explorer or a scientist. I'm only a house painter." "You're the keeper of the penguins, aren't you?" roared the Admiral. "Man alive, aren't those penguins the reason for this whole expedition?" "And who's going to see that they're well and happy if you're not along? Go put on one of those fur suits like the rest of us. We're pulling anchor in a minute." "Mama!" shouted Mr. Popper to Mrs. Popper, who had already gone up the gangplank. "I'm going too! I'm going too! Admiral Drake says he needs me. Mama, do you mind if I don't come home for a year or two?" "Oh, as to that," said Mrs. Popper, "I'll miss you very much, my dear, but we have money to live on for a few years, and in winter it will be much easier to keep the house tidy without a man sitting around all day. I'll be getting back to Stillwater. Tomorrow is the day for the meeting of the Ladies' Aid and Missionary Society, and I'll be just in time. So goodbye, my love, and good luck." "Goodbye and good luck," echoed the children, and the penguins, hearing their voices, scuttled up on deck and stood there beside the Admiral and Mr. Popper. Then they solemnly lifted their flippers and waved as the great ship moved slowly down the river toward the sea. That's it. Okay, we will start our new one tomorrow.